December 7th, 1874. A black man runs through the streets of Vicksburg, Mississippi. His breath comes in ragged gasps. Behind him, gunfire cracks through the winter air like fireworks celebrating hell itself. He's not a criminal. He's not armed. He's running because white men on horseback are hunting him like an animal. He ducks behind a building, presses his back against the cold brick. His heart hammers so hard he can feel it in his throat. More gunshots. Screaming. The sound of boots on cobblestone getting closer. He closes his eyes and prays. This man is one of 300. 300 black citizens who will be murdered in the next 48 hours in what history tried to erase as just another riot. But it wasn't a riot. It was a massacre. And the men doing the killing weren't criminals. They were the government. The Vicksburg Massacre, the racial terror history forgot. Here's what they never told you in history class. 9 years after the Civil War ended, Mississippi was on fire. Not with battle, with revenge. White supremacists had just figured out something terrifying. You don't need to win a war to destroy your enemies. You just need to make them too scared to vote, too scared to hold office, too scared to exist. And in December 1874, they turned Vicksburg into a proving ground for racial terrorism that would define the next century of American history. What you're about to hear will make you angry. But more than that, it'll make you understand why they worked so hard to bury this story. Let's rewind for a second. It's 1874. The Civil War ended in 1865. The Confederacy lost. Slavery is over. And for a brief, shining moment, America is trying something it's never tried before. Black men are voting. Black men are holding office. In Mississippi, the heart of the former Confederacy, black citizens outnumber white citizens. And they're using that power. The Mississippi state government is integrated. Black sheriffs, black judges, black representatives. For the first time in American history, the people who picked the cotton are writing the laws. Sounds like progress, right? Here's the problem. The white men who used to own those people, they're still there. They still have money. They still have guns. They still have networks. And they're watching everything they built, everything they fought for, slip through their fingers. So they make a decision. If they can't win at the ballot box, they'll win with bullets. Enter the White League. Not the Ku Klux Klan, though they're cousins. The White League is something more insidious. These aren't just random vigilantes in hoods. These are businessmen, lawyers, former Confederate officers, respected members of the community. They don't hide in the shadows. They parade through the streets in broad daylight. They publish their names in newspapers. They're not ashamed of what they're doing. They're proud. Their mission is simple: restore white supremacy by any means necessary. And their strategy? Target the black elected officials. Make examples of them. Show every black voter in the South what happens when you dare to participate in democracy. By late 1874, the White League is effectively running Mississippi. The governor, a black man named Adelbert Ames, is trying to hold the state together. But he's outgunned, outmanned, and out of options. Because here's the twist that'll blow your mind. President Grant, the guy who won the Civil War, the guy who's supposed to protect these newly freed citizens, he's exhausted. The North is tired of Reconstruction. White newspapers are calling it military occupation. So when Governor Ames begs for federal troops to protect black voters, Grant hesitates. He waits. He deliberates. And while he's deliberating, Vicksburg is about to burn. Now, let's talk about Vicksburg specifically. This city is legendary. It's where Grant won one of the Civil War's most decisive battles in 1863, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. And now in 1874, it's a political battleground. The city is run by a coalition government, Black Republicans and white Republicans working together. The sheriff is a black man named Peter Crosby. He's not perfect. Some people accuse him of corruption, but he's elected, legally, by the people. And that drives the White League insane. They don't care about corruption charges. They care about the color of his skin. So in early December 1874, they make their move. A mob of armed white men storms the courthouse. They force Sheriff Crosby out of office. No trial, no vote, just guns and threats. Crosby flees to Jackson, the state capital, to ask Governor Ames for help. Ames tells him to gather a posse and retake his office. That's legal. That's his right as an elected sheriff. But here's where it gets horrifying. Crosby doesn't gather armed militants. He gathers citizens, black farmers, black laborers, black families. Maybe 300 people, mostly unarmed. They march back to Vicksburg on December 7, 1874, demanding that their elected sheriff be reinstated. They believe in the law. They believe in the system. They believe their rights will be protected. They're wrong. The White League is waiting. Not with law books, with cannons. You read that right. They have artillery. They've set up barricades at the edge of town. And when they see these unarmed black citizens approaching, they open fire. Imagine this scene. You're walking down a dirt road. You're with your neighbors, your brothers, your sons. You're not holding a weapon. You're holding a petition. Then you hear it. The boom of a cannon. The whistle of grape shot tearing through the air. Bodies drop around you. Blood sprays across the December frost. People scream. Some try to run. They're shot in the back. Some try to surrender. They're shot in the chest. Some try to hide in the woods. They're hunted down like animals. This isn't war. This is slaughter. And it doesn't stop. For the next 2 days, white mobs roam Vicksburg and the surrounding countryside. They're not looking for criminals. They're looking for black people. Any black person. They kick down doors. They drag men from their homes. They hang them from trees. They shoot them in front of their families. Some victims are activists. Some are elected officials. But most are just people who happened to be black in Mississippi in 1874. A man named Andrew Owen, a Republican state representative, is murdered in cold blood. A man named Willis is dragged from his house and executed. Another man is burned alive. The estimates vary, but historians believe between 200 and 300 black citizens are killed. 200 and 300 in 48 hours. That's more than one person every 15 minutes. And here's the part that'll make you sick. The federal government does nothing. President Grant, who commanded the armies that saved the Union, sends no troops, no reinforcements, no protection. The massacre continues until the White League decides it's over. Not because they're stopped, because they're satisfied. They've made their point. When the smoke clears, Sheriff Peter Crosby is gone. The coalition government is destroyed, and the White League installs their own people. They don't even pretend it's legal. They just take over. And the rest of Mississippi watches. Every black voter sees what happened in Vicksburg. The message is clear. This is what happens when you participate in democracy. By the 1875 elections, black voter turnout collapses. Not because people don't want to vote, because they're terrified. White League members stand outside polling places with rifles. They write down the names of every black person who tries to vote. They follow them home. They threaten their families. And if someone's brave enough to vote anyway, they might disappear a few weeks later. Mississippi flips from a Republican state to a Democratic state overnight. Not through democracy, through terrorism. And it works so well that other southern states copy the playbook. Louisiana, South Carolina, Alabama. One by one, the gains of Reconstruction are erased. Not by debate, by blood. Now, here's where it gets even darker. You'd think a massacre of 300 people would be a national scandal, right? You'd think there'd be trials, investigations, justice. There aren't. Because the story gets buried almost immediately. Northern newspapers call it a riot, not a massacre. They imply both sides were equally violent. They use passive language. Conflict in Mississippi leaves many dead. No mention of who did the killing. No mention that the victims were unarmed. No mention that this was a coordinated campaign of racial terrorism. And the federal government? They're done. By 1877, Reconstruction officially ends. Federal troops are withdrawn from the South. Black citizens are left to fend for themselves. And the men who led the Vicksburg Massacre, they face no consequences. Some of them become governors. Some of them become senators. Some are celebrated as heroes who redeemed the South. They write the history books. And in those books, Vicksburg doesn't exist. Or if it does, it's a footnote, a disturbance. Not a massacre, not terrorism, just one of those unfortunate things that happened during difficult times. Here's what they never tell you in school. The Vicksburg Massacre wasn't an anomaly. It was the blueprint. What happened in Vicksburg in December 1874 became the model for white supremacist violence for the next century. The strategy was simple. Identify black political power, terrorize the community with overwhelming violence, install white leadership, rewrite the story as restoring order. Sound familiar? It should, because this exact playbook was used in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898, where white supremacists overthrew an elected government and killed dozens of black citizens. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where white mobs destroyed Black Wall Street. The Rosewood Massacre of 1923, where an entire black town was burned to the ground. Vicksburg wasn't the first. It wasn't the last. But it was the moment when white supremacists realized they could commit mass murder in broad daylight and get away with it. Because the federal government wouldn't stop them. The courts wouldn't punish them. And the press wouldn't even call it what it was. Let's talk about what happened next in the courts. You'd think someone would be arrested, right? Wrong. A few white men were indicted on federal charges. The charge? Violating the Enforcement Acts, laws designed to protect black voting rights. But here's the problem. The trials were held in Mississippi, with all white juries, in front of judges who sympathized with the White League. Guess how many convictions there were? 0. Not one person went to jail for murdering 300 people. In fact, the opposite happened. The defendants argued they were protecting their community from black aggression. They claimed Sheriff Crosby's supporters were the real threat. They lied about who fired first. They lied about who was armed. And the juries believed them. Or pretended to. Because the truth didn't matter. Power mattered. And in 1870s Mississippi, white supremacists had all the power. The federal government tried a few more times to prosecute White League members across the South. But every case ended the same way: acquittal or dismissal. By 1876, they gave up. The message was clear. You can massacre black citizens with impunity. The law won't protect them. Now let's talk about what this meant for the next 100 years. Because the Vicksburg Massacre didn't just kill 300 people, it killed a dream. For a brief moment after the Civil War, America was trying to be a multiracial democracy. Black men were voting, holding office, building wealth. The 14th and 15th Amendments guaranteed citizenship and voting rights. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And then Vicksburg happened, and the federal government blinked. When Washington refused to protect black voters, it sent a signal to every white supremacist in the South: you can take back control. We won't stop you. And they did. By 1900, every single Southern state had disenfranchised black voters. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. And when legal barriers weren't enough, they used violence. The Vicksburg Massacre established that terrorism worked. That you could murder your political opponents and face no consequences. That white supremacy could be maintained through blood. This wasn't just about Mississippi. This was about the entire South, and the effects lasted for generations. Jim Crow didn't happen by accident. It was built on the graves of the people who died in Vicksburg. Let me tell you about some of the people who died that December. Andrew Owen. He was a state representative, a Union Army veteran, a man who believed in the promise of Reconstruction. On December 7th, he was shot multiple times while trying to surrender. He left behind a wife and children. No one was ever arrested for his murder. Willis Williams, a farmer, not a politician, not an activist, just a man who lived near Vicksburg. He was dragged from his home at night and executed in front of his family. His crime? Being black. A man whose name we don't even know. The records just call him a Negro burned alive near Foster's Creek. Not a name, not a person, just another statistic. Think about that. 300 people died, and we don't even know most of their names. Because they weren't considered important enough to record. Because their lives didn't matter to the people writing the history. This is what erasure looks like. Here's the part that'll make you furious. The North knew what was happening. There were newspaper reports, congressional testimony, letters from Governor Ames begging for help. But the North was tired. Tired of war, tired of Reconstruction, tired of defending black rights. White Northern voters were asking, why are we still involved in the South? And politicians listened. They made a calculation. Protecting black citizens wasn't worth the political cost. So they abandoned them. In 1877, President Hayes made a deal to end Reconstruction in exchange for winning the disputed presidential election. Federal troops were withdrawn. Black Southerners were left defenseless. And the white supremacists who'd been waiting for this moment, they pounced. Within a decade, every gain of Reconstruction was reversed. Black voters were erased from the rolls. Black officials were forced from office. Black communities were terrorized into submission. And the North pretended not to notice. Now let's talk about how this story got buried. Because it wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. After Reconstruction ended, white Southerners began writing the official history. They called it the Redemption. In their version, Reconstruction was a disaster. Corrupt black politicians, Northern carpetbaggers, Southern whites just trying to restore order and good government. In their version, the White League weren't terrorists. They were heroes, patriots, men who saved the South from Negro rule. This narrative was taught in schools across the South for generations. Children learned that the Ku Klux Klan and White League were defenders of civilization, that black politicians were incompetent and corrupt, that violence against black communities was justified. This wasn't just propaganda. This was the foundation of Jim Crow. You can't oppress people for 100 years without convincing everyone, including some of the oppressed, that the oppression is justified. So, they rewrote the story, and events like the Vicksburg Massacre were erased, or minimized, or blamed on the victims. So why does this matter now? Because the tactics never went away. Voter suppression, political violence, rewriting history, claiming to restore order. These aren't relics of the past. They're strategies still being used today. After the Vicksburg Massacre, it took nearly a century for black Southerners to regain the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act wasn't passed until 1965, 90 years after Vicksburg. 90 years of disenfranchisement, segregation, and terror. All because the federal government blinked in 1874. And even now, the fight continues. Voting rights are under attack. History is being whitewashed. The same arguments from 1874 about election integrity and states' rights are being recycled. Because the Vicksburg Massacre taught white supremacists an important lesson. That if you can control the vote, you can control the power. And if you can control the history, you can control the narrative. That's why they worked so hard to bury this story. Because if people knew the truth, if they understood that democracy was overthrown by terrorism, they might ask uncomfortable questions. Like, could it happen again? For over a century, the Vicksburg Massacre was a ghost story. Whispered about in black communities, passed down through oral histories, but missing from textbooks. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s when historians started digging through archives and interviewing descendants that the full truth began to emerge. They found letters from survivors describing the horror. They found newspaper reports that Northern papers had ignored. They found congressional testimony that had been filed away and forgotten. Slowly, the story came back to life, not as a riot, not as a conflict, as a massacre, a deliberate campaign of racial terrorism designed to overthrow a democratically elected government. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it, because Vicksburg wasn't unique. It was the template. Here's the pattern they don't want you to see. Step 1. Black people gain political power. Step 2. White supremacists claim the system is corrupt or illegitimate. Step 3. They use violence to overturn election results. Step 4. The federal government does nothing. Step 6. The violence is reframed as restoring order. Step 7. The story is erased or rewritten. This happened in Vicksburg in 1874. It happened in Wilmington in 1898. It happened in Tulsa in 1921. It happened in countless small towns whose stories were never even recorded. The through line is clear. When Black Americans exercise political power, white supremacists respond with violence. When that violence succeeds, it gets rebranded as patriotism. And when historians try to tell the truth, they're accused of being divisive, of teaching critical race theory, of making white people feel bad. But here's the thing, history isn't supposed to make you feel good, it's supposed to make you understand. Let's bring this back to the human level. 300 people died in 2 days. 300 fathers, brothers, sons. 300 mothers, sisters, daughters. Yes, women were killed too, though fewer. Each one had a life, dreams, families who loved them, and they died for one reason. They believed democracy would protect them. They believed the law applied to everyone. They believed their citizenship meant something. They were wrong, not because the principles were wrong, but because the country wasn't willing to defend those principles. When we forget these stories, we don't just lose history, we lose the lessons. We forget how fragile democracy is. We forget how easily rights can be stripped away. We forget that progress isn't inevitable. It has to be fought for every single day. There's a small memorial in Vicksburg today. Most tourists don't know it exists. They come to see the Civil War battlefield, the antebellum homes. They don't come to remember the massacre, because the massacre isn't part of the official story. But there are people who remember, descendants of survivors, historians who've dedicated their careers to uncovering the truth, community activists who refuse to let the story die. They're the memory keepers, and they're fighting against a culture that would prefer to forget. Because remembering is uncomfortable. Remembering means acknowledging that America's democracy was built on a foundation of violence, that the freedoms we celebrate were denied to millions, that the redemption of the South was actually its darkest hour. But uncomfortable isn't an excuse for ignorance. Here's the truth they tried to bury. The Vicksburg Massacre wasn't an aberration. It was American democracy working exactly as designed. Because when the Constitution was written, we the people didn't include everyone. And when Black Americans were finally included after the Civil War, the system found ways to exclude them again. Not through law, though that came later, through terror. The Vicksburg Massacre proved that you could overthrow democracy with violence and face no consequences, that you could murder hundreds of people and rewrite the story, that power, not justice, determined the truth. And that lesson echoed for generations. Every lynching, every riot, every act of voter suppression, they all trace back to moments like Vicksburg. Moments when the country had a choice: protect democracy or protect white supremacy, and chose white supremacy. So the next time someone tells you America has always been a democracy, remember Vicksburg. Remember the 300 people who died believing their votes mattered. Remember the elected officials who were murdered for the crime of being black. Remember the federal government that looked away. Remember the history books that erased it all. Because this is an ancient history. The last survivor of slavery died in 1971. That's not that long ago. My grandparents were alive when Black Americans couldn't vote in the South. This isn't a story from some distant past. This is the foundation our present is built on. And if we don't understand that foundation, if we don't reckon with what happened in Vicksburg and 100 other places like it, we're doomed to repeat it. Democracy isn't a guarantee, it's a choice we have to make every single day. On December 7, 1874, white supremacists killed 300 black citizens in Vicksburg, Mississippi. They weren't punished, They were celebrated. And for 150 years, America pretended it never happened. But it did happen. And now you know. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? The Vicksburg Massacre, a story America tried to forget. Subscribe for more hidden history. Share this video. This story deserves to be told.